So do you anticipate that unless, or perhaps in the light of Trump getting into the White House, which I think we all think he's going to get into anyway for a second term, that the Ukrainians might well be lost?
Well, it's been the policy, more or less, ask any Ukrainian, that the West has maintained a policy for the last 2 years where we'll give you enough not to be defeated, but we won't give you enough to win. The danger is that we don't know how much the Russians, their ability to regenerate and to concentrate their forces on a certain area. And we don't know the center of gravity of the Ukrainians entirely, nor do they, because the manpower appears to be one of the things. But ammunition is an absolute catastrophe at the moment. They've said clearly that keep your F-16s, give us more 155mm ammunition, because that's the currency of the current battlefield. The battlefield has changed dramatically in the 2 years that the war has been happening. One of the things that's changed is that helicopters are no longer welcome on the battlefield. Even the most sophisticated attack helicopters are basically death traps, and both sides have realized that. And that's come as a brick to the forehead to the United States, who maintains the largest rotary air fleet in the world. And what they're saying now, what the rest of us are saying, is that battlefield helicopters, including Apache and one of the latest versions, are only safe about 15 miles behind the front line. And they're there to act as light cavalry to sweep up breakthroughs and things and the like behind the front line. What they can't do is go forward to the forward edge of own troops, because they will be destroyed. Drones rule the roost, and drone warfare has brought in an ominous glimpse of the future. I anticipate in 3 years' time, autonomous land vehicles, robots, drones, call them what you will be doing most of the forward action with human-based resources, again, stepping back from that and acting as a backstop. That's the reality of how fast warfare is changing. That's not to even look at what's happening with the confrontation in the Far East with China. And that's a level of sophistication many times above in terms of AI, artificial intelligence, and genome understanding. And that's where you test the DNA of whole populations, you know their vulnerabilities, and you're able to use biological weapons against them specifically to kill those groups. That's harvested through artificial intelligence by having large, cheap medical contracts with Western countries, where as a byproduct, you harvest the genome information from their populations, and then you arm yourselves against them. We have no defense in that. The United States has banned any Chinese pharmaceutical companies carrying out any research involvement of any type whatsoever that could possibly go into the United States genomes. We're increasing our access, but we're standing with our finger in our mouth saying, but it's really cheap. Russia itself is dying. Its population will be Muslim, about a third of its population, or maybe more than that in 5 years' time. Its birth rate is collapsing. The Chinese regard the Russians as crash test dummies to test against the West, and a completely expendable resource which they will use. And that's why the invasion of Ukraine happened in the timing it did, immediately after the Beijing offensive, pardon the pun, Winter Olympics. The Chinese regard the Russians as an expendable item, and a robust and regenerative one. And so they have no limit to what they will use them for. On the other hand, they're no friends, because if Putin was to be dethroned and the Russian generals took over, and we were to be sensible, unlike we were in 1989, and kill the Russian new regime with kindness and embrace them into our system to an extent that Russia became part of NATO in 5 years' time. The new front line of NATO would be the Russian Far East, where there's Russian territories which have Chinese majorities and which are contested by the Chinese. And we and the rest of NATO, that would be our front line. So that's the Chinese view of NATO. The other problem the Chinese have ultimately is that they're trying to prevent the future, a bit like the Iranians and the North Koreans. And their population is volatile and vulnerable. They're ultimately dying from a virus called 421, which is 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child. And it means it's an inverse. It means they're going to get old before they get rich, and they cannot sustain that. They also have reject populations, including the Uyghurs and other populations and Mongols that they are trying to, and Tibetans that they're trying to control within their nation. But ultimately, one reason the generals don't want to go to war, whereas Xi Jinping does, in order to burnish his legacy after his death. The generals and the population, the Politburo, don't want to go to war because they're ultimately a very traditional and superstitious people. Every Chinese soldier that you shoot, 4 families come off the Orbat, gone like Scottish regiments, cease to exist. Every single one. And they've thought about that, and they said, we don't really want that. All the people who don't really understand these situations say, but that's nonsense. Look at the hordes of Chinese that fought in the Battle of Imjin. My regiment fought there in 1951, probably killed up to 10,000 Chinese soldiers as a battalion. What people forget is they were Chinese, but they were Chinese communists. Those were Chiang Kai-shek's army. That Mao Zedong said, how do we get rid of these? And one of the generals said, let's fight the Americans in Korea and we'll get rid of them quick enough. And he's like, that's a good idea. And that's exactly what they did.
Do you anticipate that the Chinese government will subsume Taiwan sooner rather than later?
I think that the view that the Politburo now take is that despite the huge pressure and conflict within the Politburo, we've seen the defense minister and the foreign minister both removed for spurious reasons. The view of the generals is that it's probably mission impossible at the moment. In order to invade Taiwan, the Chinese would need to isolate an island 180 miles away from the nearest base. In reality, it's closer to about 300 miles because most of the usable landing beaches are on the rear. They need to isolate it physically, electronically. They need to have air supremacy, and they need to have diplomatic isolation for not less than 6 weeks to 2 months. And the generals are telling the Politburo that's not possible. And so therefore a physical attack of Taiwan is frankly at the moment not viable. That's not to say that they're not thinking in long term how they would subvert elsewhere. The tactic used by many evil subversive groups around the world is typified by Sinn Féin in Ireland. Sinn Féin have a strategy that they don't want to grow. They understand they can't grow because they're an evil bloody machine involved in criminality and murder. So their strategy is, we won't grow, we'll wait for the rest of you to shrink, and then we will fill out there. And that's exactly what's happening in Irish politics. That's what the Chinese hope to happen in the region, to see other regimes, including ourselves, shrink away to insignificance. They stand tall amongst the poppies and succeed in that way.
Now, don't forget to keep updated at www.defencereview.uk and subscribe to the next podcast wherever you get yours, and join us for the next explosive episode with Colonel Tim Collins and me, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford.